The gymnasium at Fort Campbell smells like floor wax and old folding chairs. I was at the back wall in my dress uniform when my mother-in-law took the microphone at the unit awards ceremony and told 300 soldiers that I had abandoned my daughter and that no medal fixed that. The room went completely still. And then something happened that I had not prepared for. But to understand that morning, you need to know what came before. My name is Sergeant First Class Iris Calloway. I was 33 years old the morning of the 44th Military Intelligence Battalion's annual awards ceremony at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. I was a signals intelligence analyst assigned to the battalion's collection management cell, a position I had held for 3 years after 8 years of working through every entry-level and mid-grade intelligence function the Army had. My job was to take raw signals data, thousands of intercepts per day, and determine which ones mattered and why, and to whom and in what order. I was good at this. In 2019, during a 9-month deployment to Djibouti, I identified a pattern in cellular traffic that my team had flagged as background noise for 6 weeks, and that turned out to be the communication signature of a logistics network the brigade had been trying to locate for 4 months. My battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Weisner, cited that work specifically in my deployment evaluation. I keep that evaluation in a folder in my desk at home, next to my daughter's first school photograph and my late husband's dog tags. My husband's name was James. He died in a vehicle accident outside Kandahar in 2018, 11 months into his second deployment, and 7 months after our daughter Cora was born. I was at Fort Campbell when it happened. I was 29 years old with a 7-month-old daughter, and I was a widow before I had fully understood what being a wife meant. I will not spend long on that part. James was a good man and a careful father in the 7 months he had. And I have tried every day since to be both things at once, which is harder than it sounds, and which I am still working on. James's parents are named Gerald and Patricia Morrow. They live in Bowling Green, Kentucky, about 60 miles north of Fort Campbell, in a house they have owned for 30 years. Patricia Morrow is the kind of woman who brings food to funerals and organizes the church auction, and is therefore considered, by the people who see only the surface of things, to be a good person. I believed this for 5 years, because I had reason to. When James died, Patricia drove to Fort Campbell the same day and sat with me in my kitchen while I made phone calls I did not know how to make. And she held Cora for 3 hours while I handled the paperwork that a military death generates. I was grateful for that in a way that does not go away even now, even knowing what I know. The betrayal does not cancel the grief, and it does not cancel the gratitude for the real things. I want to be clear about that before anything else. I had no reason to think anything was wrong with the arrangement. That was the problem. When Cora was 2, I agreed that she would stay with Gerald and Patricia during my next deployment cycle, a 12-month rotation to Kuwait, beginning in January of 2021. I had no other family close enough to help. My own mother was in Oregon and not well. James's parents were an hour away. They knew Cora. Cora was comfortable with them, and they had a house and a yard and the kind of daily stability I could not provide from 7,000 miles away. I drew up a limited guardianship agreement with an attorney in Clarksville, Tennessee, a temporary document authorizing medical and educational decisions for the duration of my deployment. Set to expire 30 days after my return. I signed it. Patricia signed it. Witnessed and notarized. I kept a copy in my desk drawer. Gerald and Patricia took Cora on the 10th of January 2021, and she waved at me from the back seat of their Buick. And I stood in my driveway and watched them drive away, and told myself that this was what a responsible parent does when she has no other options. She makes the practical choice, and she lives inside it. I found out later that while I was standing in that driveway watching the Buick turn out of sight, Patricia had already had the consultation with the attorney in Bowling Green that would lead to everything that followed. She had started the process the week after Cora arrived. The first sign I dismissed. Patricia sent me a message in March asking whether I had thought about what Cora's schooling would look like when I redeployed, given that my duty station might change. I wrote back that we would figure it out when I was home and thanked her for thinking ahead. I did not ask why she was raising the question in March. The second sign, Gerald mentioned on a video call in May that they had spoken with an attorney about estate planning and wanted to make sure everything was documented in case something happened to them while Cora was in their care. He said it was just being thorough. I said that was sensible. I was a signals analyst. I found patterns in noise for a living. I missed this one completely. The third sign was not a sign, it was my daughter. In July of 2021, during a scheduled video call, Cora was quiet in the way a 3-year-old is quiet when something is sitting on her that she does not have the words for yet. I asked how she was doing. She said she was fine. I asked if anything had happened. She looked off to the side of the camera, then back at me, and said in the careful voice of a child who has been coached, but not coached well enough, "Grandma says you might not come home." I asked what she meant. She says some mommies don't come back, and then someone else takes care of you. I kept my face level. I kept my voice level. I told Cora I was completely safe and that I would see her in 4 months. I ended the call 20 minutes later, and I sat at my desk in my housing unit in Kuwait with both hands flat on the surface, and I stayed completely still for approximately 2 minutes. I was not panicking. I was processing. These are different things, and I had learned the difference at some cost. I called the attorney who had drafted the limited guardianship agreement at 0600 the next morning, Kuwait time. She pulled the file and confirmed the document was exactly as I remembered: temporary, limited, expiring 30 days after my return. She said there was nothing in it that could be converted to permanent guardianship without a court proceeding with full notice to me as the biological parent. I wrote down everything she said word for word. Then she mentioned something she said she had been trying to reach me about during my communications blackout. 3 weeks prior, her office had received a written inquiry from a law firm in Bowling Green asking for a copy of the guardianship agreement, citing a pending family court petition filed in the name of Gerald and Patricia Morrow. She had not responded pending my direction. There was a petition in family court in Warren County, Kentucky, filed while I was deployed, seeking permanent guardianship of my daughter. It was the 19th of July, 2021. The time was 06:22 in the morning. I was sitting at a plywood desk in a housing unit in Kuwait with a satellite phone pressed against my ear, and I felt something happen at the base of my skull that was cold and very precise, like a system shutting down non-essential functions and rerouting everything to one task. Not grief, not anger, calculation. I called my attorney back in 30 seconds with 4 specific questions. She answered all 4. By the time I hung up, I had the beginning of a plan and the name of a family law attorney in Clarksville she recommended, and the understanding that I had 5 months remaining in my deployment and that every one of those months was going to matter. They had no idea what they had just done, and I was going to let them keep not knowing for a while. Now I want to be clear about where I was at that point. I was 7,000 miles from my daughter with 5 months left in my rotation. I had a pending family court petition I had never been formally served with, which my attorney said was a procedural violation in itself. I had a 3-year-old who had been coached to believe I might not come home. What I also had was 9 years of professional experience in the understanding that the most dangerous thing you can do when you identify a threat is to let the threat know you have identified it. I had not called Patricia, I had not called Gerald, and I was not going to, not yet. Because what I was about to find, once I started pulling the full record, was going to show me that this had not started with the guardianship petition. It had started earlier, in a direction I had not yet looked, and what I found there was going to change every assumption I had brought into this situation. The family law attorney in Clarksville was a woman named Renee DuPont. She had practiced in Montgomery County for 21 years and had handled military custody cases for 17 of them, which meant she understood the specific ways that deployment cycles create legal vulnerabilities that people with bad intentions know how to use. Her office was on Main Street above a tax preparation service, and she spoke with the flat economical directness of someone who has sat across from too many people in crisis to spend words on anything that does not move the situation forward. I reached her by phone on the 20th of July. I walked her through everything in order: the limited guardianship agreement, the video call with Cora, the inquiry to my original attorney, the petition filed in Warren County. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Were you ever formally served with the petition?" I said I had not been. She said, "That is their first mistake. It will not be their last." She said it without satisfaction, just as an assessment, the way you note a pattern in data that tells you something about the source. She told me 4 things. First, as the biological parent with no prior court findings against me, I had an extremely strong presumption in my favor under Kentucky family law, and a temporary military deployment did not constitute abandonment under any standard a family court would apply. Second, the fact that I had not been properly served meant the petition had a procedural defect that could be used to delay proceedings until I returned, which was exactly what I needed. Third, I needed to file a formal response to the petition immediately, through her, establishing my position on the record before any hearings proceeded in my absence. Fourth, I needed to document every contact I had with Cora from this point forward: dates, times, duration, what was said, her demeanor, anything unusual. She said, "You are an intelligence analyst. Document this the way you document your work." I told her I already was. I filed the response to the petition on the 28th of July. Renee drafted it, and I reviewed it by secure email from Kuwait and approved it in under an hour. The response stated that the biological mother was currently serving in the United States Army on active deployment, that she had been denied proper service of the original petition, that the temporary guardianship arrangement had been entered into voluntarily for the purpose of the deployment, and contained no language suggesting any permanent transfer of custodial rights, and that the biological mother would seek full restoration of custody and all associated legal fees upon her return. Renee told me after she filed it, "Now they know you are not asleep." I began building the documentation file the same day. Every video call with Cora, noted by date and time and duration and content, every message from Patricia, printed and dated, every message from Gerald. I went back through my phone and reconstructed the prior 6 months of contact, noting the specific language each of them had used and the questions each of them had asked. What I was looking for was the pattern. The shape of preparation. The places where the questions were slightly too pointed, where the interest in my plans was slightly too specific, where a reasonable concern about a deployed mother's child shaded into something that was gathering information for a purpose. I found 3 conversations with Patricia from the preceding December, before I deployed, in which she had asked detailed questions about my housing situation at Fort Campbell, whether my lease was month to month, whether I had considered that frequent moves were hard on children, whether I had thought about stability. I had answered all 3 questions honestly and without suspicion because they had sounded like a grandmother's legitimate concern. Looking at them in sequence in July, from a desk in Kuwait with a pending custody petition in front of me, they sounded like a woman who had already decided what argument she was going to make and was collecting the materials for it. I sent Renee the full documentation package. She called me the next morning and said, "The December conversations are useful. They establish a pattern of intent predating the deployment." She paused. "I need you to do one more thing. I need you to request the full case file from the Warren County Family Court. As a party to the proceeding, you have a right to every document filed. I want to see everything they submitted." The case file arrived in Renee's office by mail 12 days later. She called me after she reviewed it. She said, Quote 8. She read me a paragraph in which Patricia and Gerald argued that I had, and these were the words their attorney had used, consistently prioritized my military career over the welfare and stability of my minor child, and that my pattern of extended absences demonstrated a fundamental incompatibility between my chosen profession and the role of primary caregiver. They had submitted 4 exhibits. The first was a calendar documenting my deployment absences over 3 years. The second was a letter from Cora's pediatrician, noting that Cora had shown signs of separation anxiety at a routine visit, a notation that any pediatrician would make for any 3-year-old in any circumstance, and which their attorney had framed as evidence of emotional harm. The third was a statement from a neighbor of Gerald and Patricia's describing Cora as happy and settled in their home. The fourth was a photograph of Cora's bedroom in the Bowling Green house, neatly furnished, with her name on the wall in painted wooden letters. They had built a case. It was not a strong case, but they had built it carefully and over time, and with the specific intention of presenting it while I was 7,000 miles away and unable to respond in person. And then I pulled the full history of the Warren County family court filings under Gerald and Patricia Morrow's names. I was able to do this through a public records access terminal my attorney set up for me through her office account. And that was when I saw the date. Not July of 2021, November of 2020. 2 months after James's estate had closed. 2 months after the final distribution of his service members group life insurance benefit, which had paid $250,000 to Cora as the named beneficiary, held in a custodial account in Cora's name that I administered as her parent. In November of 2020, Gerald and Patricia Morrow had filed a separate petition in Warren County seeking to be named co-administrators of Cora's custodial account, arguing that as grandparents with substantial involvement in her care, they had a legitimate interest in oversight of the funds. That petition had been dismissed without prejudice in January of 2021, 9 days before I deployed, because the court had found insufficient grounds to override the parent administrator. I had never known about that petition. It had been filed and dismissed while I was at Fort Campbell preparing for deployment, and I had never been notified because I had not been a named party. Cora was the named party. Cora was 3 years old. They had tried to get to the money first. When the court said no, they had moved to get to Cora. The guardianship petition was not the beginning of this. It was the second attempt. I had to sit down. I was already sitting down, but I pushed back from the desk and held the printed records with both hands and read the November filing date again because I needed to be certain I was reading what I was actually reading. November of 2020, while I was at Fort Campbell, while I was bringing Cora to Bowling Green on Sunday afternoons and watching Patricia push her on the backyard swing and believing that this was a grandmother who loved her granddaughter without condition. The attorney went very quiet when I told her. I watched the silence on the phone line for about 4 seconds before she spoke. She said, "Send me the November filing." I sent it within the hour. She called back 20 minutes later and said, "This changes the presentation. This is no longer a well-meaning family making a misguided decision. This is a documented pattern of attempts to gain control of your daughter and her assets over a period of at least 14 months. She paused. They are going to walk into that courtroom believing this is still a sympathetic grandmother's story. Let them. I understood exactly what she meant. But the courtroom was not the only room I was thinking about. The room I had been thinking about since July, since the video call and Cora's careful coached voice, was the Fort Campbell Gymnasium on the morning of the 44th Military Intelligence Battalion's annual award ceremony, scheduled for the 14th of March, 2022. I was to receive the Meritorious Service Medal for the deployment work. My unit had notified next of kin as a courtesy, as they always do for awards above a certain level. Patricia had called me 2 weeks before the ceremony and said she and Gerald wanted to attend. She said she wanted Cora to see her mother honored. She said it in the warm, careful voice she used for things she had already decided. I told her the ceremony started at 9 in the morning and that Cora was welcome. I did not tell her what I had spent the past 8 months building. I did not tell her what I knew about November of 2020. I did not tell her anything except the start time and the address. I want to pause here for a moment. Because by the time I came home from deployment in January of 2022, I had the following: Renee DuPont, 21 years of family law practice, and a case file she described as the cleanest military custody defense she had handled in a decade. I had the November petition that proved this was a pattern. I had 8 months of documented video calls showing my consistent and loving contact with my daughter throughout the deployment. I had the procedural violation of improper service. I had the original guardianship agreement with its expiration clause, clean and unambiguous. And I had a family court date set for the 28th of March, 2022, 2 weeks after the ceremony. Everything I had built for 8 months was preparation for that courtroom. But first there was the gymnasium, and Patricia had chosen to be in it. And I had learned, over 8 months of sitting with what she had done, that a woman who files a secret court petition to control her dead son's child's inheritance is a woman who believes she will never be held accountable in a room full of people who know her. She had made that calculation once about a courtroom in Warren County. She was about to make it again in a gymnasium at Fort Campbell, and this time, I was going to be in the room. Everything I had built for 8 months was preparation for 2 rooms. I knew exactly what would happen in the courtroom. The gymnasium was the variable I could not fully control. But I had been reading signals long enough to know that when someone has underestimated you consistently, for years, in every context available to them, they do not stop underestimating you just because you are standing in front of them. They perform for the room they think they are in. They do not check to see if the room has changed. Patricia was about to perform for a room she had already decided was hers. She had not looked around to see who else was in it. She had not asked what 300 soldiers who had served alongside me for years might do when they heard what she had to say. I had checked the time when I pulled into the parking lot. It was 8:41 in the morning. The ceremony started at 9. I had 19 minutes of known quiet before whatever came next. The Fort Campbell Gymnasium on a ceremony morning has a specific quality of light, flat and even from the overhead fixtures, the kind of light that makes everything look equally important and equally exposed. The folding chairs were arranged in rows, facing a low stage with a podium and the battalion colors and 2 flags. The room smelled like floor wax and the particular collective warmth of 300 people in a closed space on a cold March morning. I arrived at 0841 and took my position with the other award recipients along the left wall, which is where I was standing when Patricia and Gerald came through the side door at 0850 with Cora between them. Cora saw me and pulled free of Patricia's hand and ran across the gymnasium floor in the way 3-year-olds run, with her whole body committed to it, and I caught her and held her, and she said, quote, 12 into my shoulder, with the force of a child who has been waiting to say it in person for a long time. I held her for about 30 seconds, then I set her down and looked at Patricia over her head. Patricia was wearing a dark blue dress and her church expression, the one she uses for rooms where she intends to be seen as a particular kind of person. She smiled at me. It was the smile of a woman who had decided the morning was already arranged in her favor. Gerald stood slightly behind her with his hands in his coat pockets and did not quite meet my eyes. I smiled back. I had nothing to say to him. Everything I had to say was already filed in the Warren County Family Court and scheduled for the 28th of March. I had learned, over 8 months, that the most powerful thing you can do with information is know exactly when to release it and when to hold it. I was holding it. The ceremony proceeded in the ordered way that military ceremonies proceed. Opening remarks, unit citations, individual awards called in sequence. My name was called at 0934. I walked to the stage and stood at attention while Lieutenant Colonel Wiesner read the citation for the Meritorious Service Medal. The specific language about the signals pattern I had identified in Djibouti, the assessment of the impact, the careful formal sentences that the Army uses to put value on the record. He pinned the medal and shook my hand, and I returned to my position against the left wall. The ceremony closed at 0952. The coordinator announced a brief reception in the same space, light refreshments at the back tables, families welcome to come forward. The room relaxed into the looser noise of people moving and greeting each other and the specific warmth that follows a formal event when the formality lifts. I was standing near the stage talking to my staff sergeant, a woman named Holloway, who had been on my team in Kuwait and who had driven in from her current duty station to be there. When I heard the microphone engage, not the feedback squeal of an accidental activation, the deliberate click of someone who has picked it up and switched it on with purpose. Patricia was standing at the podium. The coordinator, a young specialist who had been managing the event audio, was standing 3 feet away from her with an expression of a person who has just had something taken from them and is calculating whether retrieving it is within their authority. The room did not go quiet immediately. It went quiet in the way rooms do when something is registering as wrong before anyone has articulated why. Conversation by conversation, the noise dropped until the only sound was Patricia's voice and the hum of the overhead lights. She said she wanted to say something about her daughter-in-law. She said her son had died in service to this country and that his daughter deserved better than a mother who chose deployment over her child year after year. She said I had left Cora in the care of grandparents who loved her because I had prioritized my career over my family, and that no medal changed what kind of mother made that choice. She said I had always been a source of shame in the family, that James had deserved better, and that everyone in the room should know the kind of person they were honoring. She said it into a microphone in a gymnasium full of 300 soldiers. She said it looking directly at me. I did not move. I had Cora on my hip, which I had not planned but which was where she had ended up when the room began to change, climbing up to me the way small children climb toward what feels safe. I held her with my left arm and I stood with my feet at shoulder width, and I looked at Patricia with the same attention I give to signals I am in the process of fully classifying. The room was completely still. And then I heard the first chair move. The soldier who stood first was a staff sergeant named Obi from the collection management cell, who had been on my team for 2 years and who I had once spent 4 hours helping work through a clearance paperwork problem that was going to delay his promotion if it was not resolved before the board date. He stood up from his folding chair and came to attention facing me. No expression, no comment. Just standing. The woman next to him stood, then the man beside her. It moved through the formation the way things move through groups of people who share a common language, not because anyone called it, but because the meaning was immediately clear to everyone who understood the context. Row by row, in the flat, even light of that gymnasium, 300 soldiers stood up and came to attention and turned to face me. Junior enlisted and senior NCOs and 2 warrant officers I had worked with on my previous tour. Holloway stood beside me. The coordinator stood up from behind the audio table. Even Lieutenant Colonel Wiesner, standing at the edge of the stage, set down his coffee cup and came to attention. 300 people, standing, silent, facing me and not her. Patricia still had the microphone. I watched her understand what had happened, the specific process of comprehension moving across her face. Confusion first, then the attempt to reframe it, then something that was not quite recognition but was close to it. She lowered the microphone. She looked at the room. The room did not move. I transferred Cora to my right hip and walked toward the podium. Not fast. Cora had her hand on my collar and was very still in the way children are still when they understand that something important is happening around them, even if they cannot name it. I stopped about 5 feet from Patricia, and I said in a normal voice, the sentence I had been carrying for 8 months. The family court date is the 28th. Bring your attorney. I said it quietly enough that only the people immediately nearby could hear it. I did not need the microphone. Patricia looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at the room again, the 300 people still standing at attention in complete silence, and her expression settled into something I had not seen on her face before, the look of a person who has performed in the wrong room and cannot find the exit quickly enough to make it look like a choice. She set the microphone on the podium and picked up her purse and walked toward the side door. Gerald followed her without looking back. The door opened and closed and they were gone. Behind me, quietly, the formation began to stand down. The noise of the room came back. Cora said into my ear, "Mama, why is everybody standing up?" I told her they were being polite. She considered this for a moment and then said she was hungry. Holloway laughed beside me, short and genuine, and I felt something release in my chest that had been there since July. Lieutenant Colonel Weisner appeared at my left shoulder. He looked at the door where Patricia had exited and then at me and said, "You good, Calloway?" I said I was. He said, "Good." He picked his coffee back up and walked toward the refreshment table, and that was the entirety of his editorial comment, which was exactly the right amount. The Warren County Family Court hearing was on the 28th of March. It lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Renee presented the full case: the original guardianship agreement and its expiration clause, the improper service, the 8 months of documented contact, the November 2020 petition for control of Cora's custodial account, and the pattern it established. Gerald and Patricia's attorney had prepared for a sympathetic grandmother narrative and found himself in a different proceeding than he had expected. The judge, a man named the Honorable Douglas Brent, dismissed the guardianship petition with prejudice, which means they cannot file it again, and awarded me full legal fees. He noted in his oral findings that the November filing demonstrated a pattern of conduct inconsistent with the best interests of the child, and that a biological parent's military service did not constitute grounds for custodial transfer under Kentucky statute. He said it plainly and put it on the record, and moved to the next case. I stood in the parking lot of the Warren County Courthouse for about 2 minutes after Renee drove away. Cora was at preschool. I had 2 hours before pickup. I stood in the thin March sunlight with my hands in my coat pockets, and I looked at the sky above the courthouse, pale blue and very clear, and I breathed in cold air and the smell of a parking lot in early spring, damp concrete and the beginning of something that was not quite warm yet, but was moving in that direction. Then I got in my truck and drove to the preschool 40 minutes early and sat in the parking lot and waited. Because I could. Because there was nothing preventing me from being exactly where I wanted to be. Gerald called me 6 weeks after the hearing. Patricia did not call. Gerald said he had not known about the November petition when it was filed. He said Patricia had handled it without telling him. He said he was sorry. His voice had the quality of a man who is saying a true thing and knows it is not sufficient and is saying it anyway because silence would be worse. I told him I heard him. I told him I needed time. He said he understood. We have not spoken since. I do not know yet what that becomes. James's sister, a woman named Teresa, who had kept a careful distance from all of it, sent me a card after the hearing closed. She wrote, "My brother chose well. I'm sorry it took me this long to say so." She signed it with her phone number. We have had dinner 4 times. Cora calls her Aunt T and asks for her specifically on Sunday afternoons. I did not expect that, and I am glad of it. Renee DuPont sent me a 1-line message after the judgment was recorded. Dismissed with prejudice. Go be her mother. I printed it and put it in the folder with the court order and Cora's first school photograph and James's dog tags. 1 year later, I live in a house in Clarksville with a backyard that Cora has been systematically destroying in the way 4-year-olds destroy backyards, with a plastic slide and a sandbox, and a general attitude toward mud that I have decided to eliminate because childhood is short and the yard is muddy, and we are not leaving. I am working toward my master's sergeant. in the right places on the record. Patricia and Gerald Morrow have not contacted me since the hearing. I think about them the way I think about signals that turned out to be what you feared they were, with the grim satisfaction of having correctly identified the pattern, and with the specific grief of wishing you had been wrong. What I kept from all of it is the documentation habit. I document everything now, not from paranoia, from the understanding that the record is the only thing that exists once a moment has passed, and that the people who count on you not keeping records are counting on the absence of evidence to protect an absence of accountability. I am not going to give anyone that absence again. There is one more thing I have not told you yet. James's dog tags. I kept them in the folder for 3 years because I did not know where else to put them, and because having them in a drawer felt wrong, and wearing them felt like something I had not earned the right to do after enough time had passed. After the hearing closed, I took them out of the folder and put them on the kitchen windowsill, where the morning light comes through and catches the metal, and where Cora can see them when she eats breakfast. She asked me once whose they were. I told her they were her father's. She looked at them for a moment and then went back to her cereal. She will have more questions later. I will answer every one of them accurately, specifically, with the words that matter. That is what I know how to do. If you have been through something like this, I want to hear about it in the comments. And if you want to know what Cora said the first time I showed her a photograph of James in uniform, that story is coming next.